October 12, 1945. The chill of autumn crept through the tiny French village of Chambon-sur-Lignon. In a muddy courtyard surrounded by barbed wire, 40 German prisoners of war stood in silence. Among them was 24-year-old Hans Keller, a former infantryman from Dresden. His uniform hung loose on his starving frame. His lips trembled as he cupped a match against the wind, lighting what he believed would be his final cigarette. Every sound felt magnified: the crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic clatter of rifles being carried nearby, the low murmur of French guards. Hans inhaled deeply, the smoke burning his lungs, and whispered a prayer his mother had once taught him as a boy. He thought of home reduced to ashes by Allied bombs, of friends buried on the Eastern Front, of sins too great to be forgiven. The prisoners exchanged glances, each convinced they were minutes away from facing a firing squad. Some clenched their jaws in defiance, others stared at the ground, unable to meet the gaze of their captors. Hans flicked the cigarette butt into the mud, half expecting that to be the last mark he left on this earth. Then came the sound of papers rustling. A French officer stepped forward, his voice cold yet deliberate. The Germans braced themselves for the death sentence, but instead of the words of execution, came a command so unthinkable that the courtyard fell into stunned silence. "You will build a house of God." Hans blinked. His heart pounded. Death had been expected. Redemption was unimaginable. For several seconds, the air itself seemed to stop moving. The French officer's words echoed across the courtyard like a riddle from another world. A house of God? None of the prisoners dared to react, as if silence alone might force a correction, a return to the execution they had resigned themselves to. Hans felt his stomach twist. He had prepared for bullets, not brickwork. The men beside him exchanged fleeting glances, their expressions shifting from dread to disbelief. Corporal Dieter Voigt muttered under his breath, "They want us to build a church." The idea sounded so absurd that it bordered on mockery. Yet the guards did not laugh. They handed out crude tools, shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, implements of labor instead of instruments of death. The transition was almost theatrical. The condemned had been transformed into workers in the span of a single sentence. The order carried with it an unspoken weight. These men, once sworn to Hitler's cause, were now commanded to raise walls not for the Reich, but for the very faith their regime had desecrated. Every hammer swing would resound against their past. Every stone would challenge the creed of destruction they had once followed. As the prisoners were marched toward the edge of the village, the landscape came into view. Rolling meadows stretched beneath the pale sky, and in the center of the clearing lay piles of timber, stone, and lime. The foundation of a church had already been marked in chalk on the earth, its outline unmistakable. The villagers gathered in cautious silence. Some folded their arms with suspicion, others whispered prayers that this sacred project might heal the scars left by war. For the Germans, the contradiction was unbearable. Hours earlier, they had awaited death. Now they faced a sentence far stranger: to build salvation for their enemies. Hans clenched the shovel placed in his hands. His mind screamed, one thought: this cannot be real. The march to the construction site felt heavier than chains. Every footstep pressed down with the weight of memory streets once trampled beneath German boots. Villages burned in retreat, families shattered by occupation. Now those same men were paraded as outcasts, their destinies rewritten by the stroke of a French officer's command. Hans Keller dragged his shovel across the ground, its metal edge scraping against stone, producing a sound that pierced the stillness. Behind him, Private Ernst Bauer muttered, "Better to die quickly than live like this." His voice carried bitterness, yet his eyes betrayed exhaustion deeper than anger. They were soldiers forged in the crucible of Hitler's Reich. Years of propaganda had painted their enemies as less than human. Faith had been twisted into ritualized loyalty to a dictator. To them, cathedrals were relics of weakness, not sanctuaries of hope. Yet here, on foreign soil, they were being forced to craft a monument to the very God their leaders had mocked. Villagers lined the path, their stares burning more than any whip. Mothers clutched children, whispering curses in hushed tones. Some spat on the ground as the column passed. Others remained silent, unwilling to grant even acknowledgement. The prisoners bore the hostility without protest. They understood it had been earned. At the site, the framework of the church awaited like an unfinished sentence. Timber beams lay stacked, stones arranged in neat piles, mortar sacks resting in rows. Nothing about the place resembled punishment, it resembled possibility. That paradox unsettled the men more than gallows ever could. Hans tightened his grip on the tool. The thought gnawed at him. Building this structure was not just labor, it was judgment. Each brick would remind them of what they had destroyed across Europe: synagogues reduced to rubble, towns left smouldering, faith silenced by fire. And now, destiny demanded they reverse that legacy, one stone at a time. The irony struck like thunder. Men who once tore down were condemned to raise up. For the first time since capture, Hans did not fear death. Instead, he feared something far more unbearable, living long enough to face his own conscience. Morning fog clung to the fields as the prisoners arrived at the clearing. Instead of a barren wasteland or quarry, they found an organized work site prepared with precision. Lumber neatly stacked, freshly cut stones aligned in perfect order, and tools gleaming as though awaiting craftsmen rather than captives. The sight unsettled them more than barbed wire ever had. Hans Keller stopped in his tracks, staring at the rows of timber. "This isn't punishment," he whispered. "It's construction." His voice carried disbelief, as if naming it aloud might change the reality. Around him, hardened veterans shifted uneasily, struggling to comprehend why their captors had prepared materials so carefully. The French overseers issued instructions in firm but measured tones. No rifles were raised, no threats barked. Instead, carpenters from the village demonstrated how to set foundations, how to align stone for stability. The prisoners watched in silence, their expectations collapsing brick by brick. Private Bauer bent to lift a wheelbarrow, expecting rust and decay. Instead, he found polished handles, sturdy wheels, and oiled axles. These were not the cast-offs of war, these were instruments meant for creation. He muttered, almost to himself, "They actually want this to last." As hammers struck, the first notes of labor echoed across the meadow. The sound was foreign construction, not destruction, yet it carried a rhythm that drew even the reluctant into motion. For the first time since capture, sweat flowed from work rather than fear. From the edge of the site, villagers gathered in hushed clusters. Children pointed curiously, elders folded arms, priests bowed heads. The prisoners felt their gaze pressing heavily, but no insults were hurled, no stones thrown. Instead, silence ruled, a silence far more suffocating than hatred. Hans gripped the handle of his shovel, forcing it into the soil. The earth gave way easily, and with it, so did the certainty he had clung to. He had braced for a bullet. Instead, he was laying the first trench of a foundation. The realization sank like lead. This was not a temporary task. They were not simply laboring for survival. They were being commanded to build permanence, something destined to outlast every uniform, every banner, every memory of war. By midday, the prisoners' stomachs groaned louder than the clatter of tools. Since capture, rations had been thin, watery soup, crusts of stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger had carved deep lines across their faces, sharpening cheekbones into blades. Many expected the French to work them until collapse, then leave them to starve. But as the church walls began to rise a few inches, a surprising command broke the monotony: "Rest, eat." Guards gestured toward a long wooden table set under the shade of a chestnut tree. Steam curled upward from iron pots, the unmistakable scent of stew drifting through the cold air. Hans froze, uncertain whether this was mockery. Yet the aroma told no lies. Meat, carrots, onions, simmered into something almost heavenly. Bread loaves, still warm, lay stacked in baskets. The sight alone made several men dizzy. Tentatively, they approached. French villagers, not soldiers, ladled the food. Wrinkled hands served with measured calm, eyes avoiding direct contact, yet no venom lingered in their gestures. A cup of milk was placed into Bauer's rough palms. He stared at it as though it were a chalice. When Hans tore into the bread, the crust crackled, releasing steam. It burned his tongue slightly, but he chewed greedily, overwhelmed. Between gulps, a whisper escaped him. "It tastes like forgiveness." His words hung fragile in the air, startling even himself. For a moment, conversation hushed. The paradox was unbearable. Men who had once burned villages now received nourishment from the very people scarred by their march. Food had become something greater than sustenance, it was a message. Some prisoners ate silently, guilt flooding with each bite. Others wept without shame, the taste of kindness clashing violently with memories of conquest. One diary later recorded, "That stew filled more than my belly, it filled the emptiness of my soul." As bowls emptied, a strange silence replaced clattering spoons. No guard barked an order, no villager spat a curse. The only sound was the wind rustling through the chestnut branches, as if heaven itself had exhaled. The Germans had braced for cruelty. Instead, they received mercy, served on wooden plates, mercy far more disarming than any weapon. The next dawn broke with a sky streaked in pale gold. Mist clung low across the meadow as hammers, shovels, and wheelbarrows waited like instruments for an unplayed symphony. One by one, the prisoners were ordered to begin. No speeches, no threats, just the silent expectation that walls would rise. Hans Keller lifted the first stone, its weight shocking his thin arms. The chill of the rock seeped into his skin, reminding him of graves he had seen carved during campaigns across Europe. He lowered it into place, and the sound echoed a dull thud that reverberated deeper than any gunshot he had ever fired. Others followed. Bauer mixed mortar, the grey paste clinging to his hands like judgment. Dieter Voigt swung a mallet, each strike ringing like a confession against wood. The rhythm of construction emerged: scrape, lift, pound, settle. It was mechanical yet strangely ritualistic, as if each motion scrubbed away fragments of their past. For men trained to destroy, creation felt alien. Yet with every aligned brick, the paradox grew heavier. They were raising not a barrack, not a warehouse, but a sanctuary, a house where prayers would one day echo, where villagers would baptize children, where bells would toll peace instead of alarm. Hans glanced at his fellow prisoners. Sweat streaked across hollow faces, muscles trembled, yet no one resisted. Instead, an eerie determination gripped them, as though labor itself had become a strange penance. Every stone seemed less like punishment and more like an opportunity to undo, however slightly, what could never truly be undone. From the tree line, villagers continued to watch. Some folded arms, unimpressed. Others stood transfixed, as though witnessing a miracle disguised as labor. A priest whispered a psalm under his breath, words carried faintly on the wind. As dusk approached, the first section of wall stood chest high. The prisoners stepped back, gazes fixed on their own creation. It was crude, uneven, far from holy, but it was standing. For Hans, the sight pierced deeper than bullets ever had. A thought emerged uninvited. Each brick was not merely construction, it was redemption laid in stone. The first true test did not come from aching muscles or heavy stones, it came from the stairs. Each morning, as the prisoners marched toward the half-built chapel, villagers emerged from cottages and fields, forming a silent corridor of judgment. Their gazes cut deeper than whips, forcing the Germans to confront not only their task, but also the eyes of those who had suffered beneath their boots. Children watched with raw curiosity, pointing toward the striped uniforms, whispering questions their parents refused to answer. Mothers pulled little ones closer, as if the sight of these men alone carried contagion. Old men leaned on canes, their faces carved by both grief and contempt, eyes narrowing whenever a prisoner faltered. Hans Keller felt their scrutiny like a physical weight. He remembered advancing into foreign towns during the war, how civilians would lower their eyes in fear. Now the roles had reversed. He was the one who could not hold a gaze. At the worksite, the crowd thickened. Some villagers muttered prayers, others spat on the ground near the tools. The sharp silence between jeers was worse than the insults themselves. A young boy hurled a pebble that struck Bauer's shoulder. The guard did not intervene. No punishment followed. Instead, Bauer kept working, jaw clenched, sweat mixing with dust on his skin. Every gesture became theatre. When Hans hoisted a beam onto his shoulder, he felt as though the entire village judged his strength. When mortar spilled onto the ground, whispers rippled through the watchers. Nothing escaped notice, every mistake amplified by the collective gaze. Yet something unexpected stirred beneath the scrutiny. As walls climbed higher, some villagers no longer scowled. A few even nodded faintly, acknowledging skill or endurance. An elderly woman crossed herself when the first wooden frame locked into place, as though daring to hope that sanctity might rise from hands once stained with ruin. By sunset, the stairs had carved themselves into memory. The prisoners marched back to camp with blistered palms, shoulders bent, but the weight of stone was nothing compared to the weight of human eyes. For Hans, that unspoken trial felt harsher than bullets. Death could have ended guilt instantly. Living beneath constant judgment meant confronting it endlessly. Snow fell in hushed layers across the village, blanketing the unfinished chapel in silence. December's chill stiffened fingers turned breath into clouds and slowed every motion. The prisoners worked with numb hands, mortar freezing before it could set, stones slipping from their grasp. Yet the structure continued to rise, stubborn against the season, just as stubborn as the men compelled to build it. On the morning of December 24th, the guards issued a different order. Tools were set aside, and the men were led not to the construction site, but into the heart of the chapel's growing frame. A priest stood waiting, robes draped in white, candles flickering against the skeletal walls. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Was this a ceremony for them, or for their humiliation? Hans Keller's pulse raced as he stepped beneath the half-built rafters, snowflakes drifting through open beams above. Villagers gathered quietly, filling the cold air with anticipation. Then, the first note of a hymn rose. A French voice, trembling yet resolute, sang, "Silent Night." Another joined, then another, until the unfinished chapel swelled with melody. To the prisoners' astonishment, a few Germans tentatively added their voices. Soon, two languages blended into one carol, an echo that seemed to melt the frost clinging to stone and heart alike. Hans felt his throat tighten. He remembered singing the same hymn beside his mother years earlier, long before uniforms, long before war. The sound now, shared with former enemies, pierced through layers of guilt. Tears blurred his vision, falling hot against frozen cheeks. Candles flickered brighter, their glow reflecting off snow-dusted beams. For one fragile hour, hatred receded. No rifles, no orders, only song. Guards lowered their weapons, villagers lowered their guard, and men who once destroyed villages sang of peace beneath the same sky. When the final note faded, silence lingered, heavier than any sermon. The prisoners did not clap, nor did the villagers cheer. They simply stood together, breathing in the same winter air, knowing something irreversible had occurred. That night, Hans wrote in his diary, "We expected death. Instead, we found Christmas." Winter passed, but the work never slowed. By early spring, the chapel walls stretched higher, beams locked into place, and scaffolding creaked under weary boots. Yet among the German prisoners, something unexpected began to stir. Not defiance, not rebellion, but rivalry. Without a word spoken, each group of men began to measure themselves against the others. When one team raised a wall straighter, the next pushed harder to perfect their alignment. If mortar on one side smoothed cleanly, the opposite crew mixed theirs thicker, determined not to be outdone. Even exhaustion could not suppress the silent competition growing with every stone. Hans Keller noticed it first. Bauer's squad carried beams with exaggerated force, dropping them onto supports with a crash, inviting attention. Voigt's section responded by working longer without breaks, sweat soaking through thin uniforms, faces red with strain. Nobody openly challenged the others, yet every hammer swing was a statement. We will not fall behind. The guards did not interfere. In truth, they seemed to encourage it, standing back with folded arms as the rhythm of rivalry pushed progress forward faster than threats ever could. The chapel rose at an astonishing pace, fueled not by faith but by pride. From the sidelines, villagers observed this peculiar contest. Some sneered, whispering that arrogance still clung to these men. Others, however, recognized the transformation. Soldiers who once fought for conquest now fought only for precision, for endurance, for a wall that stood taller than the last. Hans felt the competition within himself. Each stone he set straighter, each line he smoothed sharper, was less about survival and more about reclaiming fragments of dignity stripped away in defeat. He wanted the structure to stand not as evidence of his chains, but as proof of his labor. By summer, the chapel no longer looked like a ruinous frame. It looked like a sanctuary in progress, driven upward, not by orders, but by rivalry that had become its own unspoken fuel. As the chapel walls climbed higher, the prisoners began to find another outlet besides hammers and mortar scraps of paper. Torn from old notebooks, hidden in coat linings, even carved into wood slivers, words became a secret currency of survival. They wrote not for delivery but for release. Hans Keller scribbled by candlelight inside the barracks. His handwriting shook, lines smudged by tired fingers, yet every sentence carried weight. "Mother," he began, "I no longer know if I deserve to return, but today I placed one stone upon another, and for a fleeting moment I felt almost human again." The letter folded neatly into his pocket, destined never to leave. Others poured out confessions just as raw. Bauer confessed in one draft, "I carried rifles into villages. Now I carry bricks into God's house. How can both be true?" Voigt wrote bitterly of frostbite and hunger, yet ended with the words, "Perhaps we are building not for them, but for ourselves." None dared to send these words. To admit such vulnerability risked ridicule, yet by writing they carved fragments of conscience back into existence. Sometimes the guards found pages abandoned in bunks. Instead of destroying them, they returned them silently, perhaps recognizing the humanity bleeding through ink. The villagers, too, occasionally glimpsed prisoners mouthing lines under their breath as they worked, memorizing words they would never post. One evening, Hans tucked his note beneath a loose stone in the chapel wall. He imagined it remaining there long after his bones had vanished, a hidden witness to what no tongue could utter aloud. The irony gnawed at every man. They had once sent orders that brought destruction across Europe. Now, their only messages were unsent confessions buried in shadows. Every brick raised the church higher. Every unwritten or hidden letter raised their awareness deeper. Even as the chapel walls stretched toward heaven, the shadow of war refused to release its grip. Every stone laid seemed to echo with ghosts, reminders that Europe's wounds had not yet begun to heal. News travelled slowly to the camp, carried by guards, villagers, or smuggled newspapers, but when it came, it struck like thunder. Word spread of Nuremberg. High-ranking leaders sat in judgment, their crimes laid bare before the world. Testimonies of atrocities poured out names, places, numbers that dwarfed imagination. For the prisoners in France, each headline felt like a mirror held to their own faces. Hans Keller listened as Bauer read fragments aloud by firelight. The barracks fell into silence, broken only by the wind outside. "Crimes against humanity," Bauer muttered, the words foreign yet unmistakable. Nobody replied. They all knew what it meant. The chapel they built seemed suddenly fragile, a hollow shell against the enormity of guilt. Each man wondered privately if his own name might one day appear in similar records, if he too would be summoned to stand before a tribunal. Villagers sensed this tension. Their eyes lingered longer, sharper, as though measuring whether these men were merely labourers or accomplices in unspeakable horrors. The prisoners carried that suspicion like invisible shackles, heavier than iron chains. At dusk, Hans sat on the scaffold, gazing across the snowy hills. He thought of Dresden reduced to ash, of his comrades buried without graves, of the propaganda that had promised glory but delivered only ruin. The hammer in his hand felt useless against the enormity of memory, yet work continued. Every morning, stones were lifted, beams secured, mortar spread. The rhythm was mechanical, almost desperate, a struggle to drown out the trials playing in their minds. For some, each brick became a prayer for absolution. For others, it was a futile gesture, a monument that could never balance scales already tipped by death. The shadow of war hung over the rising chapel like a storm cloud. Even as sunlight struck the walls, the men beneath it remained haunted. They were building not only against gravity but against judgment itself, racing to raise something holy before history fully condemned them. Summer sunlight beat down on the meadow, bleaching the half-built chapel in gold. The walls now towered above a man's height, enclosing shadows where once only open air had lingered. Yet the true challenge loomed above them, the roof. Without it, the sanctuary remained vulnerable, exposed to every storm. With it, the chapel would finally resemble a house of God. The prisoners gathered as massive beams were dragged into position. Sweat poured from their brows, mixing with sawdust and grit. Ropes strained, pulleys groaned, and hands blistered as timber rose inch by inch toward the waiting sky. Every creak threatened collapse, every slip risked crushing bones beneath the weight. Hans Keller braced his shoulder against the wood, muscles trembling. Around him, Bauer and Voigt pulled in unison, their breaths coming ragged but determined. It was no longer about orders. It was survival, pride, and something deeper none dared to name. Villagers lined the edges of the field, watching the spectacle with narrowed eyes. Children gasped each time a beam tilted dangerously. Women clasped hands, whispering prayers as ropes tightened. The labor became theater, every movement an unspoken plea for strength. Slowly, the frame locked into place. The sound of hammers striking nails rang like a drumbeat, steady, relentless, echoing far beyond the meadow. With each strike, the outline of a roof emerged, reaching skyward like arms raised in supplication. Hans paused to catch his breath. Looking upward, he saw the skeleton of the structure arching above him, no longer just wood and stone, but something transcendent. For a fleeting moment, he felt as though the very act of lifting the roof was lifting them all, carrying their burden toward heaven. As the final beam slid into position, the chapel stood transformed. Shadows stretched beneath its shelter, offering protection where before there had been only exposure. Villagers murmured in awe. Some crossed themselves, others wept quietly, unable to reconcile the sight of enemies raising something sacred. For the prisoners, exhaustion blurred into revelation. The roof symbolized more than completion, it was defiance against despair, a declaration that creation could still emerge from hands once trained for ruin. Hans lowered his hammer and stared upward. The chapel no longer felt like punishment, it felt like testimony. They had built not merely a roof against weather, but a roof against judgment, a fragile shield between guilt and grace. Autumn returned, crisp air sweeping across the valley as the chapel neared completion. The stones were set, the roof sealed, windows framed, and the altar carved by hands that once carried rifles. All that remained was the bell its hoisting would mark the moment when the structure ceased to be a project and became a church. The entire village assembled in the meadow, forming a ring around the building. Guards kept watch, but their weapons hung low, almost forgotten. Children clutched their parents' hands, elders leaned on canes, and priests in simple robes prepared blessings. The air quivered with anticipation. The prisoners filed in, uniforms faded, faces gaunt yet resolute. At the center lay the bronze bell, massive and gleaming, its polished surface reflecting sunlight like liquid fire. For a moment, silence reigned, every breath waiting, then ropes were thrown. German prisoners seized them, joined unexpectedly by French villagers. Fingers once curled around triggers now wrapped around coarse hemp, pulling in rhythm with those who had suffered their invasion. The bell rose slowly, swaying as if reluctant to leave the earth. Strained grunts mixed with shouts of encouragement, the sound carrying across the hills. Hans Keller felt the cord burn against his palms. Muscles screamed, lungs ached, yet something beyond survival drove him upward. He locked eyes with a villager hauling beside him, neither spoke, but both pulled harder, bound by the weight of the same burden. At last, with a final heave, the bell reached its tower. It slid into place with a metallic ring that cut through silence like lightning. Cheers erupted from the crowd, though some wept instead, unable to contain emotions that blurred grief with wonder. The bell rope was offered to the prisoners. Hans hesitated, then grasped it firmly. With one pull, sound thundered across the valley, deep, resonant, undeniable. a symbol born not of conquest but of reconciliation. For the villagers, it was proof that sanctity could rise from ruin. For the prisoners, it was proof that their labor had meaning beyond chains. The unveiling was not merely of stone and metal, it was the revelation of something neither side expected, that even enemies could, for one moment, build together. The chapel doors opened for the first time on a frosted morning. Candles lined the aisle, their flames trembling against newly plastered walls. The scent of pine boughs, laid carefully along the altar, filled the air with a fragrance of purity. Villagers entered quietly, their footsteps soft against the stone floor, eyes wide as they gazed at the sanctuary built by men they had once cursed. The prisoners were permitted inside, though they remained standing at the rear. Their uniforms, patched and worn, contrasted sharply with the villagers' Sunday clothes. Yet for this occasion, no one raised a weapon. The guards themselves stepped aside, as though even discipline bowed to the sanctity of the moment. The priest began in French, voice steady, words flowing like a river of solemnity, prayers for peace, for healing, for the dead whose names filled every family's memory. The congregation whispered responses, their chorus weaving through the cold air. Hans Keller bowed his head. Though he could not understand every word, he felt the intent pressing against his heart. Then, without warning, a sound rose from behind the voice of a prisoner humming a familiar melody. Another joined, then another, until a German hymn intertwined with the French liturgy. Two languages filled the same space, colliding yet blending, neither overpowering the other. The villagers hesitated, then some followed, letting their French verses ride upon the Germans' solemn tune. The chapel swelled with harmony unlike anything the valley had ever heard. Hans lifted his eyes. Tears blurred the candlelight into halos. For a moment there were no uniforms, no victors, no vanquished, only voices bound by yearning for something greater than vengeance. The hymn ended, leaving silence thick and radiant. No applause followed, no declaration was made. Only the echo of prayer lingered, an invisible thread binding those who had once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. For the prisoners, it was proof that redemption might be possible. For the villagers, it was proof that peace could begin not with treaties, but with voices joined in fragile harmony. That morning, in a chapel built by enemies, a single prayer rose in two tongues, and heaven, it seemed, listened. The chapel stood complete, its bell tower piercing the sky like a finger pointing heavenward. Where once there had been mud, timber piles, and trembling captives, now stood a sanctuary clothed in stone, wood, and faith. Time itself seemed to pause as villagers entered freely, while German prisoners lingered at the threshold, gazing at what their own hands had raised. Hans Keller walked slowly toward the altar, boots echoing across the flagstones. He carried no weapon, only a worn notebook pressed against his chest. The same man who had once awaited execution in a muddy courtyard now stood in a house of worship he had helped create. He knelt, not from command, but from something deeper. Opening his notebook, he wrote, "I came here waiting for death. Instead, I found life hidden within stone and song." The words bled into the page like a final confession. Bauer stood beside him, staring at the stained glass windows newly fitted into the walls. Sunlight broke through them, scattering colours across the faces of men who had once marched beneath banners of conquest. Now those same faces glowed beneath symbols of peace. Villagers entered, some still cautious, others openly curious. An old woman touched the edge of a pew and whispered, "Forgiveness leaves deeper marks than hatred." Her words carried softly, but Hans heard them as though spoken directly into his soul. The bell tolled again, its sound rolling across fields where once troops had marched. It was no longer an alarm, no longer a summons to arms. It was a proclamation that war had ended, that even its prisoners had chosen creation over destruction. For Hans, every strike of the bell felt like a heartbeat. Each toll reminded him that life had been granted where death was expected, not because he deserved it, but because someone believed mercy could echo louder than vengeance. He closed his notebook, eyes lifted toward the tower. The same courtyard where he had braced for bullets had given birth to a house of God. His journey from despair to redemption had been laid in mortar, timber, and faith. From death to life, that was the story carved into every stone of the chapel. And long after uniforms had rotted and memories had faded, its bell would still speak, reminding the world that even enemies could build a sanctuary together. The story of those German prisoners reminds us of something larger than war. They arrived expecting bullets and graves, but left behind a sanctuary that still stands as testimony. A church built not by choice but by chains became proof that even the darkest hands can raise something holy when guided by mercy instead of revenge. Hans Keller's words still echo through history. I came here waiting to die. Instead, I learned to live again. And that is why this tale matters today. Because in every ruin, there lies the chance to build. In every enemy, there may still be a builder. And in every ending, there may yet be a beginning. If this journey moved you, if you felt the weight of the firing squad, the silence of the villagers, the hymn rising in two tongues, then know this. Countless other stories of World War II still wait in shadows. Stories not of battles alone, but of impossible choices, human transformations, and moments when hatred collided with hope. So if you want to uncover more forgotten tales like this one, stories that take you into the mud, the fear, the silence, and the redemption, then subscribe now. Join us as we bring history back to life, one untold story at a time. Because the past is not just dates and numbers, it is voices, prayers, and the ringing of a bell that still tolls today.